I'll give you $1 million if you can read this letter." The CEO sneered in the middle of the lavish party, mocking the poor waitress. But when she spoke, the entire room fell silent. Do you believe a single sentence can change a person's fate? Watch until the end, because this waitress's comeback will keep you glued to the screen. Emma Rivera closed the door of her shabby apartment behind her, her shoulders heavy as if carrying an entire exhausting week. By now, she should have been lying on her worn-out sofa, wrapped in a wool blanket, halfway through a book, letting the noisy world outside fade on its own. But right at 6 o'clock, the phone in her pocket buzzed. The screen lit up with a message from Clara, her co-worker and the only close friend still in touch, followed by a string of crying face emojis. "I've got a fever, Emma. Please cover this shift for me, will you? It's a Hendrix Global party. The tips will be great." Emma looked at the text and sighed. She wasn't in the mood, but she couldn't bring herself to say no. And that's why, instead of lying on the sofa, she was standing in the service elevator of Hendrix Tower, a cold metal box carrying her up to the 90th floor. She hated parties like this, not because of the work, but because of the feeling of being lost in a world where people never have to think twice about dinner. A world where a person's worth is measured by the brand of a watch, the height of a heel, and the chill in a glance. In the prep area, Emma swapped her jeans and sweater for a simple black uniform, hair in a high bun, no makeup. A perfectly fitted cloak of invisibility to get her through the night unnoticed. Just finish the shift, take the money, and disappear. When the door to the ballroom opened, she stepped into another world. A black marble floor gleamed like a mirror, reflecting the shimmer of rows of crystal chandeliers. The air was thick with wine, perfume, and power. Background music blended with the clink of glasses, a luxurious, hollow symphony. Emma took a silver tray lined with goblets of red wine, gleaming like rubies, and slipped into the crowd, quiet, deft, a shadow among gods. On a small dais in the center of the room, Lucas Hendrix was speaking. He was the center of this universe, tall, handsome, a perfectly tailored suit, a smile custom-built for cameras. His voice carried steady and assured, amplified by a refined sound system. We celebrate the difference between those who create success and those who only stand by and watch. Emma paused for a second. The phrase, "those who stand by and watch," pricked at something deep inside her. She knew he wasn't talking about her, but somehow the words still stung. Elsewhere, Lucas wrapped up his speech to a round of applause. He raised his glass and smiled in return, but the smile never reached his eyes. This party was supposed to honor his father, the founder of Hendrix Global. But all he'd heard all evening were comparisons. Richard was truly remarkable. He has his father's vision, just not the experience yet. A few soft chuckles, a few pats on the shoulder, like consolation. Lucas had had more to drink than usual, not drunk, but enough to blur the line between restraint and wounded pride. The wineglass in his hand had become the only tool of power he had left. And when a splash of red streaked across his shirt, a ridiculous stain in the middle of a perfect party, that line shattered. An overexcited guest stepped back and bumped into Emma. It was a light jolt, but enough to tilt the entire tray, sending a stripe of red wine down the pristine sleeve of Lucas Hendrix's white shirt. In the ballroom, the music seemed to cut out, a heavy silence, with every gaze turned toward them. Reflex took over. Emma immediately bowed her head. "Oh, I'm truly sorry, sir." She set the tray down, pulled a napkin to blot the wine, trying to keep it quiet and quick. But a few giggles broke out, small laughs, but mean ones. They were laughing at the stain on the heir's shirt, not at her. But in Lucas's eyes, she was the stain. He felt a hot surge rising. Her apology only made him feel more humiliated. A twisted smile spread, cold and sharp. This is why servers should stay out of the spotlight. He said it loud enough for everyone to hear. Emma's hand froze. She said nothing, just lifted her head to look at him. It wasn't defiance, just the tired gaze of someone far too used to being dismissed. She gave a small, polite nod, then turned to leave. It was that calm that truly made Lucas angry. He was used to people being afraid, scrambling to make amends. But her, a nameless waitress, daring to walk away from him as if he were nothing. Wait. His voice dropped, ice cold. Do you know that in a few minutes, this entire building will belong to me? A boast, or a warning. He wasn't sure himself. Emma turned back, her eyes steady, unreadable. Then, congratulations, sir. 3 gentle, courteous words, yet they reflected the emptiness in his power, like a mirror. Lucas tightened his grip on the glass. Something inside him blew apart. Anger, yes, but also the shame of being exposed in front of a crowd. He had to seize back the upper hand. He had to prove she was small. He pulled an old ivory-colored envelope from the pocket of his suit jacket, a prop his assistant had handed him earlier, part of the anniversary speech about the company's history, with an old Latin quote from the founder inside. An idea flashed through his mind, reckless, fueled by alcohol and wounded pride. "You seem smart," Lucas said, his voice dripping with mockery. "So try this. $1 million if you can read what's in here." The air went rigid. Everyone around them held their breath. A ridiculous dare, but no one dared speak up. Emma looked at the envelope in his hand. She could see the hollowness behind that smile. She exhaled softly. "No, thank you. I just want to finish my shift." She turned again, but Lucas stepped forward, blocking her path. "Afraid you'll look foolish? Or is your pride that expensive?" Murmurs rippled through the crowd. Emma stopped. She looked at him for a long time. There was something in her eyes that unsettled Lucas. Not anger, but pity. "Give it to me," she said quietly, her voice steady now. He smiled, a smug, victorious smile, and placed the envelope in her hand. The paper was yellowed, the Latin script scrawled. Emma opened it and was silent for a few seconds. Then her voice rose, light, precise. Every word clear. "Qui potentiam tenet, et humanitatem obliviscitur, umbra sua devorabitur." The sound rang out like a stray note in a heavy room. She lifted her head, her eyes never leaving Lucas. "He who holds power and forgets his humanity," she paused, "will be devoured by his own shadow." The entire hall went dead silent. Somewhere, a glass shattered, slicing the quiet. Emma folded the paper, handed the envelope back to Lucas. "It seems you're forgetting the very thing this letter reminds you of." Without another word, she walked away. With each step, the marble floor answered with a soft, steady rhythm. Behind her, Lucas stood rooted. His suit jacket was stained with wine, his hand clenched around the envelope, and dozens of eyes were on him, no longer admiring, but curious, edged with discomfort. That night, in his glass-walled penthouse, Lucas looked down at the city. The lights of Manhattan blurred in his eyes. He unlocked his phone. The video of the incident was everywhere. The hashtag #1M waitress flooded social media. He watched his own face again and again, taut, arrogant, defeated, hundreds of mocking comments. He scrolled through them like a swimmer in cold water, numb, until he stopped at a single line. "Is the man in the video the son of Richard Hendricks?" His hand went still. For a moment, the room was so quiet he could hear his own heartbeat, heavy, off-kilter, and strange. Lucas's finger slid across his phone screen and stopped on that comment. "The man in the video. Is he Richard Hendricks's son?" The question wasn't an accusation, but it pierced him deeper than any taunt. It wasn't about a spilled glass of wine or a clever waitress anymore. It had touched something Lucas had always protected, his father's legacy. He tossed the phone onto the sofa. The silence in the penthouse turned heavy. Manhattan's lights glittered beyond the vast glass window, but they couldn't scatter the darkness closing in on him. That night, Lucas didn't sleep. He sat in front of his laptop, blue light washing over his face, sharpening his features until he looked older than his 35 years. He replayed the clip over and over, the volume turned low. He wasn't watching himself anymore. He was watching her. The way she stood straight, the way she pronounced those ancient Latin words flawlessly, and above all, the deadly stillness in her eyes when she placed the envelope back into his hand. That wasn't the confidence of someone who had just improvised successfully. It was the certainty of someone who knew exactly what she was saying. Curiosity turned into an obsession. He had to know who she was. One brief call to the head of security, who owed him a favor, and 5 minutes later, a PDF file appeared in his inbox. Name, Emma Rivera. Position, seasonal employee, event services. Age, 27. Address, Dorchester, Boston. Basic facts, nothing remarkable. He almost closed the file. Then his eyes stopped on the last line. Emergency contact, John Rivera, father, deceased, 2015. The name rang like an alarm bell from a distant past. John Rivera. Lucas had to rummage through his memory. He wasn't a business rival or a politician. He was a journalist, an obstinate investigative reporter who had spent nearly 2 years trying to expose a chemical scandal at one of Hendrix Global's old plants. Lucas remembered the tense evenings when his father, Richard Hendrix, ended phone calls with a frown and a sigh. He called Rivera a bloodhound that never gives up. In the end, the story sank. Rivera never found conclusive evidence, and Hendrix Global stood firm. Now, the daughter of that bloodhound had appeared, reciting an aphorism about humanity and power right in front of him. Number. This couldn't be a coincidence. At Hendrix Global's offices, Lucas moved like a storm. Brenda, the head of PR, a sharp woman who had worked for his father, hurried after him. Lucas, social media's going crazy, she said anxiously. They're hailing that girl as some kind of hero. The trend right now is that you should actually pay her the $1 million. Lucas stopped at the office door and turned to look at her, his eyes cold as ice. $1 million is only worth it, he said dryly, if it can buy silence. Find out everything about her. And about her father. The desk phone rang the moment he sat down. Unknown number. He picked it up. Lucas Hendrix. A gravelly male voice came through, rough like stones scraping. Who's speaking? A friend of your father's. Don't dig into that girl's past. Some doors are better left closed. Click. 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 The call ended. Lucas tightened his grip on the receiver. He turned toward the floor-to-ceiling window. From this height, the people below looked like ants, but one figure had broken away from the crowd. A man in a dark coat, standing motionless across the street, looking straight up, straight at his office. That night, when Emma returned to her apartment after her shift at the cafe, something felt off. The door wasn't locked, just slightly ajar. A chill raced down her spine. She pushed it open gently. Inside was chaos. Drawers yanked out, books thrown from the shelves. But her laptop was still there. Her wallet, with a few coins, still sat on the kitchen counter. Whoever had broken in wasn't after money. They were searching for something else, and it seemed they hadn't found it. But they had left a message. On her ransacked desk, amid the scattered papers, one item had been neatly placed. A photograph. It was a picture of her father, John Rivera, sitting at his desk, smiling with a pen in hand. What made Emma's breath catch was what sat on the table in front of him, a stack of ivory envelopes identical to the one Lucas Hendricks had handed her the night before. At that same moment, Lucas's phone pinged. A new email from another anonymous address. No subject line, just a single attached image. He opened it. It was a scanned photograph, taken at the opening ceremony of the factory where his father had once faced John Rivera's accusations years ago. In it, Richard Hendricks Sr. and John Rivera were shaking hands, both smiling. Below the photo, a scrawled note read, "Truth costs more than $1 million." Lucas stared at the smiles of the two men who were supposed to be enemies. He zoomed in, scanning every detail, searching for answers. His eyes swept across the blurred crowd behind them. And then he froze. His heart stopped. Standing just behind John Rivera was a little girl, maybe 8 years old, with 2 braided pigtails, looking straight into the camera. Her large, solemn eyes were identical to the ones that had stared at him the night before. It was her. It was Emma Rivera. The photograph. The little girl. Emma. Lucas slammed the laptop shut. The sound echoed through the empty apartment. Coincidence was dead. This was a message, sent to him deliberately. He didn't know who had sent it, but he knew exactly where to start. He grabbed his car keys and rushed out the door. No call to security, no call to his lawyer. This was personal. 15 minutes later, his black sports car screeched to a halt in front of the main entrance of Hendricks Tower. Striding across the marble lobby, he headed straight for the event management office. The manager, a middle-aged man with a perpetual smile, went pale the moment he saw the CEO walk in at this hour. "Mr. Hendricks, how can I help you, sir?" "Emma Rivera," Lucas said flatly, skipping any greeting. "She served at last night's dinner. I need her contact information." The man's smile faltered. "Sir, I'm afraid for privacy reasons we can't—" "She's not your employee, is she?" Lucas cut him off. No, sir." Ms. Rivera was a temp from a staffing agency. She only covered a shift for someone who called in sick. "Then call the agency," Lucas ordered, his tone leaving no room for argument. "Tell them the CEO of Hendricks Global is requesting her address." Right now, the manager swallowed hard and quickly picked up the phone. Power was an efficient tool. 5 minutes later, Lucas had what he wanted, an address in Dorchester, Boston. The drive from Manhattan to Dorchester felt like traveling between worlds. He left behind the realm of glass and steel skyscrapers, where even the air had a price tag, and entered a neighborhood of 3-story brick houses, laundry lines strung between windows, and kids kicking a ball along the sidewalk. He found the street, a row of near-identical buildings pressed tightly together. Parking his expensive car by the curb, it looked as out of place as a spaceship that had crash-landed in a small town. Her apartment was on the 2nd floor. He rang the bell. No answer. He rang again. Still silence. He checked his watch. Only 3 in the afternoon. Maybe she was working another job. He turned back toward the car, but didn't leave. He would wait. Lucas Hendricks, the man who could make the stock market tremble with a single rumor, now sat in a 6-figure car on a quiet street, waiting for a part-time waitress. He could feel the curious eyes of neighbors peering through their curtains. A faint irritation, mixed with self-awareness, crept in. He wasn't used to the world moving on anyone's schedule, but his own. Near 6 o'clock, as the sun dipped low, he saw her. She walked down the street, carrying a small grocery bag, dressed in jeans and a simple sweater. She looked different from the woman in the black uniform the night before. Younger, a little worn out. She froze when she spotted his car. There was no fear in her face, only guarded wariness and a trace of annoyance. She looked at the car, then at him stepping out of it, and sighed, as if his presence was just another inconvenience in a long day. "Lost?" she asked evenly. "Or just looking for $1 million parking spot?" Lucas didn't respond. "I need to talk to you." "I don't think so." She climbed the steps and slid the key into the lock. "I think everything that needed saying was said already." "Not about last night," he said quietly, his tone softer, less sharp. She turned around, her eyes slightly narrowed. "So, what is this about? Your apology? Or another one of your challenges?" Lucas took a deep breath. "I just want to know why you did it. Why you read that line out loud, in front of everyone. What was the point?" Emma looked at him for a long moment. She didn't answer right away. When she finally spoke, her voice carried no sarcasm, just the calm tone of someone who had already endured too much bitterness. "You called it a performance. But I wasn't performing, Mr. Hendricks." She paused, her fingers tightening slightly on the strap of her bag. "I've worked in service for almost 6 years. I know people like you, people who believe that money gives them the right to make the world spin their way. I've met hundreds of them, but none has ever said what you said last night." Her gaze drifted somewhere distant, as if she were speaking to herself. "You know, some people spend their whole lives just trying to stand close to the light. They're not behind it because they're lesser. They're behind it because no one ever invited them to step forward." Lucas didn't reply. For the first time, he didn't know what to say. Her words slipped quietly into him like a thin needle, not painful, but one that kept bleeding long after. Emma continued, her voice softer now. "A $10 lesson in humility can sometimes be worth more than $1 million banquet. Don't you think?" She finished without waiting for an answer. Her face no longer showed anger, only a strange calmness, as if every wound had been folded neatly into that single sentence. Lucas stood there, silent. In that moment, he realized there was something familiar in her eyes, the same look his father had in his final years, when he sat quietly through accusations from the press, never once defending himself. For the first time, Lucas felt ashamed, not because he'd been challenged, but because he'd forgotten what his father used to say over and over. "Strength isn't in winning. It's in how you face defeat." He exhaled, his tone softening. "All right. You're right." He paused, as if admitting it first to himself. "But there's something I need you to see." He unlocked his phone. The screen's glow sharpened his tense expression. He held it out to her, a photo sent by an anonymous number. Her father, John Rivera, shaking hands with Richard Hendricks. Behind them stood a little girl, with eyes exactly like hers. The dying afternoon light reflected in Emma's eyes. The familiar hint of irony disappeared. Her breath caught, her hands trembled slightly. Where did you get this picture?" she asked, her voice breaking. Lucas looked at her, his arrogance gone. "I don't know. Someone sent it to me, and I think it connects both of us." She sank down onto the steps, silent for a long while. In her lap, the small grocery bag she carried slipped open. A few oranges rolled out, stopping at Lucas's feet. He bent down, picked them up, and placed them gently back into the bag. It was a small, awkward gesture, but for the first time, he didn't move like a CEO. He moved like a man trying to understand the world all over again. Emma's world narrowed down to that single image on the phone screen. Her father, John Rivera, was shaking hands with Richard Hendricks. Both men were smiling, radiant and trusting, and between them stood a little girl with braided pigtails and a serious gaze staring straight into the camera. That little girl was her. A small fragment of the past she thought she'd buried forever. The calm shell Emma had built around herself began to crack. Where did you get this?" she asked, her voice thin and dry, stripped of any sarcasm. Lucas didn't answer right away. The light from the phone screen reflected in his eyes, giving them a strange, deep glow. "First, answer me," he said quietly. "Your father is John Rivera, the investigative journalist, right?" Emma nodded, barely, almost imperceptibly. "Yes, he's my father." Lucas lowered his hand, his tone softer now, the usual firmness gone. Then, "What does this photo mean?" "I was taught that my father and yours were enemies." A short, bitter laugh escaped Emma's throat. "Enemies? That's the kindest word you could use." She leaned back against the apartment door, as if needing its support to keep from collapsing. "Your father destroyed my father's life." Lucas said nothing. She lifted her head, her eyes gleaming with raw pain. "They said my father died in a car accident in 2015, late at night on the highway. But I knew him. He never drove when he was tired, never drank. And before he died, he told me he'd found the final piece of evidence in the Hendricks Global scandal." Her voice trembled, brushing against a wound that had never healed. Lucas listened silently. In his mind, scattered fragments of memory about his own father began to stir. Richard Hendricks, working late into the night. The harsh phone calls. The way he dodged every question about that old scandal. Emma took a deep breath. "I spent 3 years in California, doing graduate research in classical languages," she said softly, a sad smile crossing her face. "That's why I could read that Latin text. But then, I quit everything. I came back to Boston 6 months ago, taking any job I could, just to trace what my father left behind. I'm not looking for money. I'm looking for answers." Her gaze returned to the photo, distant and uncertain. "He always kept this picture on his desk. I used to think it was just a memory. Now, I'm not so sure anymore." The space felt drained of sound. The distant hum of traffic blended with the soft whisper of wind through the old window frames. Lucas looked at her, and in that moment, he no longer saw the woman who had humiliated him, but someone standing amid the ruins of her own memories, trying to piece together a truth long buried. He spoke quietly, his voice low and steady. "I don't know what connection your father had with mine, but someone clearly wants us to stop looking." She lifted her head, eyes guarded. "What do you mean by that?" Lucas told her everything, from the anonymous comment to the strange phone call to the man who had stood outside his office that morning. His voice was even, yet it grew hoarser with every word, as if each sentence carried more weight than the air around them. Emma listened. At first, she didn't believe him, but when he mentioned the caller who claimed to be a friend of his father, and that chilling line, "Some doors are meant to stay closed," her expression changed. She went silent. Then, softly, "Why should I believe you? All of this could be an act. You're a Hendricks, and my father died because of them." Lucas met her eyes. "If I wanted to scare you," he said, his voice calm, almost weary, "I wouldn't have driven 3 hours just to wait outside your house like an idiot." "There are easier ways," Emma said nothing. She studied him for a long time. The streetlight cast a pale glow across his face, revealing the exhaustion no one in the media had ever seen. For the first time, she didn't see the cold man from that party. She saw someone hurt, someone also searching for answers buried in his own past. And in that moment, something inside her shifted. A fragile, hesitant trust, small, but real. She could hear her heartbeat blending with the distant sounds of the city, the heartbeat of someone who had long stopped believing, now daring to believe again. So, what now? Emma asked, her voice softer. She didn't invite him in, but the wall between them had begun to fade. Lucas looked up. Your father was investigating the chemical leak. My father denied it. But if he found something, it's still somewhere in the company's old archives, the ones I still have access to. She frowned. And you think they'll just let you go digging around? Not let, he said. I'm Lucas Hendricks. I can go anywhere I want in that corporation. The question is, will you come with me? Emma stayed quiet. Trusting him would be madness. Yet, in his eyes, she saw something truer than any vow, a crack between power and conscience. Why are you doing this? She asked. This is your father's legacy. Lucas gazed into the distance, where the night sky draped itself over the city. I'm not seeking justice for your father, he said slowly. I just want the truth about mine. And now... He turned back to her, the streetlight flickering in both their eyes. It seems those two truths are the same. That honesty, raw and unguarded, was the very thing that made her believe him. She nodded, her voice quiet but firm. Tomorrow, 9 a.m., here. The door closed, softly but decisively. Lucas stood alone under the golden glow of the street lamp, listening to the wind threading through the trees. Something inside him had shifted too, something he couldn't yet name, but knew for certain. This search would uncover more than just the truth. It would force him to face himself. At exactly 9 the next morning, Lucas's car was parked in the same spot as the day before. He didn't honk. He just waited. A few minutes later, Emma walked out of the building. She wore dark jeans, a hooded jacket, and sneakers, a practical outfit, ready for anything. She didn't carry a purse, only a phone in her hand. She opened the car door and sat in the passenger seat without a word. The air inside the luxury vehicle instantly tightened. The smell of fine leather mixed with the faint scent of cheap paper cup coffee, a strange blend perfectly mirroring their uneasy alliance. Where is it? She asked as Lucas pulled out of the street. An old industrial area in New Jersey, he replied, where the company keeps the things it prefers to forget. They barely spoke during the drive. Emma stared out the window, watching Dorchester's neighborhoods fade into the highway, then into endless rows of concrete and metal warehouses. Lucas focused on the road, his fingers tapping restlessly on the steering wheel. He was used to controlling every conversation, yet her silence was a wall he couldn't break through. The Hendricks Global Storage Facility loomed ahead, a grey concrete block with no windows, more fortress than office. Lucas parked, and for the first time, Emma saw a flicker of hesitation in him. There's a camera, she said, pointing to an old security unit mounted in the corner. They won't see anything, Lucas answered, confidence returning to his voice. The system's outdated. Besides, no one dares question me. They stepped inside. The air was damp and heavy with the smell of old paper. At the front desk sat an elderly man, thin, wearing thick glasses. He looked up from his newspaper, eyes widening behind the lenses as he recognized Lucas. Mr. Lucas, he stammered, quickly standing. I didn't expect to see you here again. Hello, Arthur, Lucas said, his tone softer now. I need to look at some old records. From 2015, Arthur looked uneasy. Records from Mr. Richards' time. They're sealed, sir. I am the rules, Lucas replied coolly. He signed the logbook, and with a weary sigh, Arthur led them down rows of towering metal shelves stacked with yellowed cardboard boxes. Northwood Chemical Plant Project, Lucas said. Everything you have. Arthur pointed toward a dimly lit corner of the warehouse. It's there. But, sir, your father once said, some things are best left buried. Then he stepped back, leaving them alone in the silence of forgotten history. They began searching. Hours passed. Lucas and Emma worked without speaking, sifting through dusty binders, dry technical reports, and printed internal emails. Everything looked suspiciously clean. The official reports told a perfect story of crisis management. A minor incident, swiftly contained, no environmental damage. "There's nothing here," Lucas said, slamming a folder shut, frustration in his voice. "Everything's been wiped." Emma didn't respond. Her eyes were fixed on the cover of the very folder he had just thrown down. Something felt off. A paperclip was slightly bent, holding a thin, unmarked document tucked inside the back cover, as if someone had deliberately hidden it there. She gently unfolded it. Inside wasn't a report or an email. It contained only about 10 pages, copies of the security log for entries and exits in this warehouse area. "Lucas," she called softly. He stepped closer. Together they flipped through each page. There were signatures from managers, engineers, and even his father, Richard Hendricks. And then they saw it. The signature of John Rivera, right beside the dates during the time he had been investigating the case. "So he was here," Emma whispered. "My father actually got inside." "But he didn't find anything," Lucas said quietly. "Just like us." He was about to close the folder when Emma stopped him. "Wait. Look at the last page." The final page had only one entry, a special access request for a single file. Independent Environmental Assessment Report, Northwood. But it wasn't the content of the request that stunned them. It was the date written beside it, November 23rd, 2015. Lucas frowned. That date. What about it? He suddenly fell silent. His eyes shifted toward Emma. Her face had gone pale as paper. It was as if all the blood had drained from her body. "Emma?" he asked, an uneasy feeling rising in his chest. She didn't look at him. Her eyes were fixed on the page, her trembling finger pointing to the date. "My father," she whispered, her voice breaking, barely audible. The police report said he died in a car accident on November 15th, 8 days before this. Lucas's heart seemed to stop. Slowly, his gaze moved from the date down to the signature at the bottom of the page. The handwriting was unmistakable, bold, firm, identical to the signatures on the earlier pages. It read clearly, J. Rivera. The air inside the warehouse felt sucked dry. Lucas and Emma stood frozen, their eyes locked on the sheet of paper. That signature, that date, an impossible truth, was staring them right in the face. 8 days, Emma whispered, her voice barely audible. He's been dead for 8 days. Lucas's instincts kicked in, cutting through the shock. He pulled out his phone, his hands steady, and snapped quick, clear photos of the document. He captured the page, the cover, the signature, everything, evidence. Whatever it meant, he had to keep it. "We need to go," he said quietly, his tone urgent. "Now." Emma nodded automatically, her mind still spinning. They replaced everything exactly as it was, gave Arthur a brief nod, and hurried out of the warehouse, back into the blinding daylight. The ride back to Manhattan was heavy with silence, but not the silence of distance. It was the silence of two people sharing a secret, too dangerous to speak aloud. Emma sat motionless, fingers clasped in her lap, eyes lost on the passing cityscape. Her father, alive? Or was this some cruel deception? A fragile, aching and dangerous hope flickered inside her, a hope she hadn't allowed herself to feel in years. Lucas was different. His mind was racing through a dozen scenarios, each darker than the last. If that signature was real, it meant his father, Richard Hendricks, had known John Rivera was alive after the accident. He hadn't just known. He might have helped orchestrate it. The legacy Lucas had spent his life protecting was starting to crack. They didn't return to Dorchester. Lucas drove straight to his penthouse. "It's safer here," he said simply as they stepped out of the private elevator. Inside, he connected his phone to the large screen in the living room. The photo of John Rivera's signature appeared, magnified, undeniable. "That's his signature," Emma said firmly, her voice steadier now. She stepped closer to the screen, as if she could feel the ink through the glass. "I'm certain. Every curve, every slant. It's my father's." "Then the question isn't what," Lucas said, pacing the room. "It's why. Why fake a death? And who had the power to make it happen? Police, investigators, death certificates, all of that would have to be arranged." "The independent environmental report," Emma said, her gaze sharpening. "That's what he requested after he was declared dead. That's the key. An independent report wouldn't be stored in the company's archives," Lucas reasoned. "It would be with the firm that conducted it." But there's no record of Hendrix Global hiring an outside agency at the time. "Then it wasn't the company that hired them," Emma said, an idea flashing in her mind. "It was my father. Or yours." "Personally," Lucas stopped. He looked at Emma, recognizing the sharp intelligence that had once caught him off guard, now fully ignited. He searched his memory, trying to recall names, his father's trusted allies from that era. Most of them were board members, people who would never dare go against the corporation's interests. But there was one man, someone who didn't belong to that world. "Dr. Alistair Finch," Lucas said, the name slipping out almost by reflex. "Who is he?" "My father's private physician. An old family friend. He retired a few years ago. He was the one who signed my father's death certificate when he supposedly died of a heart attack." Lucas stopped there. A doctor. A fake death. The pieces were beginning to fit together. Half an hour later, they were standing in front of an old stone house on a quiet street in the Upper West Side. Dr. Finch, a silver-haired man with sharp eyes, opened the door. He recognized Lucas instantly, and a warm smile crossed his face. "Lucas, my boy." It's been a long time, but his smile faded when he saw the grave look on Lucas's face, and the presence of Emma beside him. "We need to talk, Doctor," Lucas said. "It's about my father. And about John Rivera." At the mention of the second name, a flicker of caution appeared in Dr. Finch's eyes. He hesitated for a moment before reluctantly letting them into his study, a cozy room lined with books and the faint scent of aged leather. Lucas didn't waste time. He handed the doctor his phone. "I found this in the archives." Dr. Finch put on his glasses. He studied the image of the signature, and the hand holding the phone trembled slightly. He sank into his armchair and exhaled a long, weary sigh, as if setting down a burden he had carried for a decade. "I've always wondered when this day would come," he murmured. "So it's true?" Emma asked, her voice breaking. "My father, he—" Dr. Finch looked at her, his eyes full of sympathy. "It's complicated, Miss Rivera. Your father uncovered something far worse than a chemical leak. It was a systematic cover-up involving very powerful people on the board. They didn't just want to silence him, they wanted to erase him." "And my father?" Lucas pressed, his heartbeat pounding in his ears. What was his role in all this? Dr. Finch lifted his gaze to meet Lucas's, and what he said next changed everything. "Your father wasn't John's enemy. He was his ally. Richard tried to stop it from the inside, but he couldn't. When he learned there was an order to eliminate John, he did the only thing he could. He came to me. Together, we staged the accident. It was the only way to keep John alive." The room fell silent. The truth was too shocking, too far removed from everything they had believed. The two fathers had never been enemies. They were partners, trapped in a larger conspiracy. "So, where is my father?" Emma asked, her voice trembling with hope. Dr. Finch shook his head. "I don't know. After we got him to safety, Richard handled everything himself. He said the fewer people who knew, the better. But he did tell me one thing." The doctor looked straight at Lucas. "Richard said there was one person he feared above all, not the government, not his rivals, someone within his own company." "Who?" Lucas demanded. Dr. Finch hesitated, glancing toward the window as if afraid someone might be listening. He didn't say a name. He just said, "That's the only man ruthless enough to order something like this, and smart enough to never leave a trace. The man whose signature appears last on the forged environmental report." They left Dr. Finch's house and stepped into the night of Manhattan. The truth that had just been revealed hung between them, heavy and sharp as the winter air. Emma's father was still alive. Lucas's father was a silent hero. And both of them were being hunted by a faceless ghost from within his own company. They got into the car, but Lucas didn't start the engine right away. He sat still, both hands gripping the steering wheel, eyes fixed on the darkness ahead. "I've spent my whole life," he said, his voice low and almost breaking, "trying to become the man my father was. Strong, decisive, sometimes even ruthless. I thought that was his legacy. Turns out, I never really knew him at all." Emma looked at him, not with defensiveness or sarcasm this time, but with unexpected understanding. "I'm the opposite," she said softly. "I've spent the last 5 years building an image of my father as some kind of martyr, a victim crushed by the system. But he wasn't a victim. He was a fighter. And he's still out there somewhere, fighting." Silence settled over them again, but this time it carried a different meaning. They were no longer the son of a corporate titan and the daughter of a journalist. They were simply two children trying to understand their fathers. At last, Lucas turned to her, determination in his eyes. "Dr. Finch said the man who signed that fake environmental report must have done it digitally. That file has to exist somewhere on the company's servers." "And you think we can find it?" "I don't think," Lucas said, starting the engine. "I know. We're going to find it." The car sped off into the night, heading back toward the towering glass of Hendrix Global. But this time, they didn't enter through the front doors. Lucas drove down into the executive parking garage. The building was nearly empty, just security staff and the night cleaning crew. The guard at the private elevator gave Emma a suspicious look as she followed Lucas inside. "She's with me," Lucas said, his tone leaving no room for argument. The guard immediately bowed his head. They stepped into Lucas's office. The once luxurious, sterile space now felt like a command center. Lucas sat before the massive computer screen, his fingers flying across the keyboard with breathtaking precision. Emma stood behind him, her eyes fixed on the glowing interface. "Most of the old files are stored on a private server called the Vault," Lucas explained without looking up. "Military-grade encryption, but as CEO, I have the master key." He typed a long string of commands. A flurry of security windows appeared and vanished. He was slicing through his own company's digital defenses. "Search, environmental report, Northwood, 2015, he ordered. A red line of text appeared. "Access denied. Higher clearance required." Lucas frowned. "Damn it. Someone locked it behind another security layer. Even the CEO can't access it directly." "Is there another way?" Emma asked, disappointment creeping into her voice. "There's always another way," Lucas said, a faint smile tugging at his lips. "If we can't get in through the front door, we'll climb through the window." He launched another program, its interface far more complex. My father always taught me to build a back door into every system I create. He began a sophisticated cracking process, minutes stretched into what felt like hours. Finally, a soft beep sounded, and a single folder appeared on the screen. Its name wasn't Northwood. It was labeled Project Nightingale. "Oh my God," Emma whispered. Lucas double-clicked the folder. A single PDF file emerged. He opened it. It was the report, hundreds of pages thick, filled with dense scientific terminology and intricate charts, all pointing to one conclusion. The Northwood plant was completely safe. A perfectly orchestrated lie. "Go to the last page," Emma urged. Lucas scrolled down. The final page contained the approval section, signatures from the head of operations, the chief legal officer, and several vice presidents. And at the very bottom was the line reserved for the highest level of authorization, the one signature that could silence every debate and bury the truth forever. Lucas held his breath. He knew that signature. He'd seen it thousands of times throughout his career, on contracts, memos, and press releases, elegant, firm, and full of confidence. It didn't belong to a man. It read, E. Sharp. "No," Lucas whispered, his voice barely audible. "No. That's impossible." Emma looked at his pale face. "Lucas, who is it? Who's E. Sharp?" Lucas lifted his eyes to her, confusion and deep betrayal swirling in them. "Evelyn Sharp," he said quietly, "our chairwoman of the board, my father's closest friend, and my mentor, E. Sharp." Those two letters flashed on the corner of the screen like a knife, cold, clean, cutting straight into Lucas's chest. Evelyn Sharp. The woman who once held his hand at graduation, who stood beside him at his father's funeral, who told him, "You are the future he dreamed of." He could hear his own heartbeat pounding in his ears. "No," he murmured, almost to himself. "No. This has to be a mistake." His fingers trembled as he scrolled through the files in the folder labeled Project Nightingale. The name had been nothing more than a whispered legend within the company. He opened each document, memos, budget sheets, internal correspondence, and in every single one of them, Evelyn Sharp's signature appeared, decisive, confident, an imprint of absolute power. "This can't be," he whispered, clinging to a final shred of belief. Maybe she was forced. Maybe someone forged it. Emma said nothing. She simply stepped closer and placed a hand on his shoulder. The gesture was soft as breath, yet it stopped him cold. "Lucas," she said quietly. "Look." He lifted his eyes. In the reflection of the darkened monitor, he saw his own pale, shaken face, and Emma's eyes, where the truth he refused to accept, stared back at him. In that instant, he was no longer the CEO of Hendrix Global. He was just a son who had discovered that the world he inherited was built on a beautifully painted lie. "She was the last person to speak to my father the night he died," he said softly, as if to the empty room. "She said he looked tired, that he wanted to rest, wanted me to take over the work. She even put her hand on my shoulder and said, 'You have to be strong.'" He closed his eyes. That hand. He remembered it, warm, trembling, resting on his shoulder amid a sea of black coats. Now, that same voice echoed in his head, cold as steel. Emma watched him in silence. She understood. This wasn't just the collapse of power. It was the death of faith. "We have proof," she said gently but firmly. "This PDF file, it's enough to expose everything." Before she could finish, a sharp ping sliced through the room. The screen flickered, then turned red, with bold letters flashing. "Warning, unauthorized internal access detected. Security protocol, Phoenix, activated." Damn it! Lucas shot up, moving fast. He dragged the PDF file into the USB drive already plugged in. The progress bar crawled forward, each percent ticking like a heartbeat. "She knows." Emma's voice trembled. "She's the chairwoman," Lucas replied without looking away. "She set up an alert to catch anyone touching this folder, especially from my computer." The progress bar hit 100%. At that exact moment, the folder icon blinked, then vanished. A single message appeared: "File does not exist." The evidence was gone. Lucas yanked the USB drive out and clenched it in his hand, as if holding on to his father's last breath. "We need to get out of here. Now," Emma said. "Security could show up any minute." They rushed toward the door. But the moment Lucas's hand touched the handle, a dry click echoed. The LED light beside the lock turned red. The door had been locked remotely. They looked at each other. The vast office now felt like a glass cage. 90th floor. No emergency exit. No open windows. The ceiling lights went out. A pulse of red light from the emergency lamps washed over the floor, making the room seem to breathe in a nightmare. Then a faint crackle came through the intercom, and that voice spoke. "Lucas, Lucas, Lucas." The tone was gentle, warm, and ice-cold now. "I truly hoped you'd never dig this deep. Your father wanted to protect you from it." Lucas froze. His breath caught in his throat. "You," he whispered, his voice trembling with anger and despair. Evelyn's voice flowed smoothly, like she was scolding a disobedient child. "I gave you everything. This chair, this company, the shareholders' trust. All you ever had to do was move forward, never look back. And yet—" Her voice paused for a heartbeat. "You let a waitress drag you into the mud." Each word dripped from the speaker like acid, corroding the air around them. Emma gripped Lucas's shoulder, feeling his body shake. Not from fear, but from the collapse of everything he once believed. The lights went completely dark. Only the red glow from the floor remained, turning the elegant office into something spectral. Evelyn's voice came one last time, colder than steel. "Security will reach your floor in 2 minutes. They have orders to detain Ms. Rivera for data intrusion and to take you in for mental instability. Good luck explaining that USB drive from a high-security psych ward. Lucas." The line went dead. The static faded. Only silence remained, thick, suffocating, and heavy with truth. Lucas stood there, gripping the USB in his fist, the red light flickering across his face. The face of a man who had lost everything and found the only thing left worth keeping. The truth. Evelyn's voice faded, leaving behind a silence more terrifying than any threat. The crimson glow of the emergency lights washed over their pale faces, turning the luxurious office into a deadly trap. 2 minutes, Emma said, her tone steady, sharp as a blade. "They're coming." "We're locked in," Lucas said, desperate. He lunged at the door, yanking the handle to no avail. "Electronic lock. We can't break it." "Then stop trying," Emma replied, her eyes darting across the room, searching for something he, who sat here every day, had never noticed. "Your father built this place." A man like him, a man who knew his enemies could be sitting right beside him, would never design an office without a way out. Her words hit Lucas like a lightning strike to the memory. A way out. He suddenly remembered. Years ago, when he was still a cocky college kid, his father had taken him on a tour of this very office. The old man had pointed to the massive bookshelf behind the desk. "Every system needs a back door, Lucas," he'd said, "in case the system ever turns on you." At the time, Lucas thought it was just a metaphor about business. Now he understood. "The bookshelf," he said, sprinting toward it. "Password." "Hidden button?" Emma pressed, hearing the faint ding of the security elevator rising from below. "No," Lucas said, his hand brushing across the familiar leather spines. My father didn't trust things that could be hacked. He trusted ideas. He paused, trying to recall. A phrase. Something he used to say whenever he got tired of boardroom politics. He closed his eyes. His father's voice echoed in his mind. Power corrupts, Lucas. When you forget who you are, your own shadow will consume you. Your own shadow will consume you. Emma stood beside him, her heartbeat pounding in her chest. Lucas. That's it, he whispered. Their eyes met under the red light. The line you read. Those who hold power and forget their humanity will be devoured by their own shadow. He didn't look for a button. He looked for books. His fingers moved quickly, touching the spines of 3 specific volumes in exact order. A book on Roman history, Power, a collection of poems, Humanity, and a Stephen King novel titled The Dark Half, The Shadow. For one long second, nothing happened. Then, a faint click broke the silence. The entire bookshelf slid inward smoothly, revealing a dark void. A gust of stale air rushed out, heavy with years of secrecy. It was a narrow passageway leading to a steel door, an old service elevator, not listed on any building blueprints. Just then, they heard footsteps pounding outside and muffled voices over radios right beyond the office door. Go! Lucas barked, shoving Emma inside first. They stepped into the darkness. The bookshelf slid shut behind them, sealing perfectly just as the main door's keycard reader beeped in denial, followed by the crash of something heavy hitting metal. Inside the cramped elevator, Lucas pressed the only button on the panel, a downward arrow. No lights, no floor numbers. The elevator groaned to life, descending with the screech of rusted steel. As they sank lower, deeper into the unknown, it felt as if they were diving beneath the ocean, leaving behind the world they once knew. The elevator stopped with a sharp jolt. The doors slid open, not to the main lobby, but to the darkest corner of the B4 parking level, a section almost never used. My car, Lucas said. They dashed out of the elevator, sprinting between rows of concrete pillars. They were nearly there when 2 security guards, alerted by the noise, appeared at the far end of the corridor. Flashlights swept through the darkness. Stop! Who's there? One of them shouted. There was no time to hide. Lucas pulled Emma behind him and stepped into the light. It's me, he said, his voice carrying the authority of a CEO. He deliberately kept his tone calm, almost impatient. There's been a major security breach on the 90th floor. I'm taking Miss Rivera to a safe location. Evelyn Sharp has ordered a full lockdown. No one in or out without her or my direct authorization. Understood? The 2 guards froze. They recognized the CEO, but the situation made no sense. They'd been ordered to the 90th floor to apprehend someone. Yet here was the CEO himself, issuing a completely different command. Their hesitation lasted only a few seconds, but it was all Lucas needed. Do your job, he barked. I'll handle this. While they were still processing what had just happened, Lucas shoved Emma into the passenger seat of the car, jumped behind the wheel, and fired up the engine. The sound roared through the still air of the garage. He slammed the accelerator. The car shot forward, tires screeching as it whipped past the stunned guards and sped up the ramp toward the exit. They burst out of the garage, merging into Manhattan's nighttime traffic. Lucas didn't slow down. He drove like the devil himself was chasing them. And maybe he was. Once they had cleared the downtown area, Emma finally spoke, her breath still unsteady. Now. What happens now? Lucas glanced in the rearview mirror. The Hendricks Global Tower, the building that had once defined everything he was, grew smaller and smaller until it disappeared completely. He tightened his grip around the USB drive in his hand. Now, he said, his voice cold and resolute, we're ghosts. And we hunt. They didn't have much time. Lucas knew Evelyn would realize within 5 minutes that they had escaped, and when she did, she'd turned them into fugitives hunted across the entire country. He had only one chance to turn the tide, one last bullet left in his hand. The black car sped through the night, cutting across the empty streets of Queens. When it finally stopped, an old industrial building loomed ahead. No signs, no name, just a single light glowing from an attic window. "Where are we?" Emma asked, her voice still trembling from everything that had happened. "The home of an old friend," Lucas replied. "A hacker, the best I've ever known, and the only man alive who hates the Wall Street elite more than your father does." Inside, the air buzzed with the whir of cooling fans and the cold blue glow of dozens of monitors. Among piles of tangled wires and spare parts, a thin man with hair like a bird's nest looked up, his eyes sharp and electric in the neon light. "Kaito," Lucas said curtly, "I need your help. This needs to go public, not just to the press, but everywhere. Social media, forums, any place where it can spread. It has to survive, even if they try to erase it." Kaito glanced at Lucas, then at Emma. A faint, crooked smile tugged at his lips, half mocking, half sympathetic. "You're asking me to burn down an empire, Lucas. You know what? I've always liked the smell of smoke, and so, while the city slept, a digital war began. Kaito worked without rest. He didn't just copy the data, he fragmented it, encrypted it, and scattered it across thousands of servers around the world. A virus of truth, uncensorable, unstoppable. By 6 in the morning, screens everywhere flickered to life. The words "Project Nightingale" flashed like a sentence being read aloud to the world. Evelyn Sharp's signature filled every news feed. The stock of Hendrix Global collapsed like a falling dam. The world roared awake. In a damp attic in Queens, Lucas and Emma sat in silence, watching an empire crumble through the cold light of the monitors. No one spoke. Lucas simply stared ahead, hollow-eyed. He had destroyed his father's legacy, to save his father's honor. "It's not over," Emma said quietly, but firmly. "They can still claim it's all fabricated. We need a real witness." Lucas nodded. And there was only one person who could do that. They followed the trail, the hidden payments, the shell companies, the buried addresses in old banking files. At last, they found him. Not in some secret mansion or offshore hideout, but in a small nursing home in Vermont, nestled among rolling green hills. The man sat by the window, light glinting off his silver hair. When he turned around, Emma couldn't hold back her tears. "Father," she whispered, her voice breaking. John Rivera smiled, his eyes still bright and calm as ever. "I knew you two would find me," he said, his voice raspy but steady. "I've been waiting for this day." In that moment, surrounded by the scent of jasmine tea and the mountain breeze, Emma felt something she thought she had lost: peace. 3 months later, Hendrix Global had completely collapsed. A wave of investigations exposed a chain of scandals. Evelyn Sharp was arrested, her once powerful face now splashed across the front page, framed by gleaming handcuffs. Lucas Hendrix testified against her. He resigned, sold off most of his assets, and used the remainder to start a foundation. The Rivera Hendrix Community Center was built in Dorchester, where Emma once lived. No marble, no crystal, just clear glass walls, sunlight streaming through, and the sound of children laughing. Lucas and Emma stood before the brand-new bronze plaque. "It feels right," Lucas said softly. His voice carried a sense of peace. He no longer wore suits, just jeans and a simple shirt. Emma nodded. It's what they both would have wanted. A clean beginning. The center's doors opened. A boy ran out, clutching a book, his voice full of joy. "Miss Emma, look at this." On the first page, a quote was printed in bold. "True worth isn't found in what we can buy, but in what we choose to do. Emma smiled. Lucas stepped closer, a rare smile tugging at his lips. "I still owe you $1 million, he said, half joking, half sincere. "No," she replied gently. "You've already paid it back, with something far more valuable." Late afternoon. The small garden behind the center glowed in golden sunlight. Children played ball, laughter drifting through the breeze. Emma and Lucas sat on a wooden bench beside a bed of lavender, silently watching the sky change colors. The wind stirred, carrying the scent of wet grass and the soft chime of wind bells. Emma spoke quietly, her tone like a memory etched into her soul. "My father once said, 'Justice isn't about revenge. It's about ending fear.'" Lucas nodded, his gaze fixed on the swaying treetops. "And sometimes," he said, "justice is about starting over." They sat there for a long time, saying nothing more. The fading light rested gently on their faces, blending with the laughter of children and the fragrance of new grass. In that instant, the world fell silent. But it was a peaceful silence. The storm had passed, and in that stillness, Emma knew, no matter how many empires crumble, there will always be people who choose to rise again, from truth, from courage, and from a sunlit garden like this. Sometimes justice doesn't arrive with applause in a courtroom or under the glare of media lights. It comes quietly, when someone dares to speak the truth, when a child faces their past, or when two people once on opposite sides decide to rebuild faith together. The story of Lucas and Emma wasn't just about dismantling an empire. It was about rediscovering integrity and humanity in a world where power too often overshadows truth. Lucas lost everything, his reputation, his wealth, his status, but gained something far greater, the peace of no longer living a lie. Emma, once a nameless waitress, proved that courage doesn't need a title, only a heart. The Rivera Hendricks Center they built wasn't just a building. It was proof that even after mistakes, people can still choose the right path. As her father once said, "Justice isn't for revenge, it's to end fear." And Lucas finally understood. Sometimes justice is also a new beginning, where old wounds become the drive to do something better. And what about you? If there's something in your life that needs to begin again, where would you start? With truth, with forgiveness, or with faith in people? Share your thoughts in the comments below, because maybe, just maybe, your story will be the light that helps someone else start over too, just like Lucas and Emma did.